Did your parents love you, but somehow still feel emotionally distant? Like they provided, worked hard, stayed responsible, but emotional closeness always felt missing. Maybe difficult feelings were ignored. Maybe silence filled the house more than conversation did. Maybe love existed, but somehow it felt difficult to feel. And the strange part is, many parents weren't cold people. They cared deeply. They just came from a generation that learned something different. Survive first, feel later. If that feeling sounds familiar, there's a reason. Because emotional distance in families rarely begins with one person. It gets passed down, quietly, through households where people learned how to keep going, without ever learning how to talk about what hurt. Many older generations grew up during difficult times. War, scarcity, economic pressure, strict expectations. Life wasn't centered around emotional understanding. It was centered around endurance. You stayed strong, you kept moving, you handled things privately. And over time, something subtle happened. Emotional silence stopped feeling unusual. It became normal. For many people growing up back then, life felt uncertain. You focused on responsibility, not emotions. You worked hard, you stayed disciplined, you adapted. And when survival becomes the priority, emotional expression slowly moves into the background. Not because people stop caring, but because feelings start to feel less urgent than survival. Over time, many people learn something without even realizing it. Keep going. Handle it yourself. Don't burden other people. And eventually, even pain becomes something private, something carried quietly. For many families, especially for men, emotion didn't feel acceptable. Sadness was hidden. Fear stayed buried. Affection became restrained. Even comfort was sometimes replaced with discipline. You didn't talk about difficult feelings. You handled them alone. And over time, an entire generation learned how to look composed on the outside while carrying everything internally. That's why some parents rarely said, "I'm proud of you," or "I love you." Not because they felt nothing, but because emotional closeness wasn't something they were taught to practice. Sometimes love looked more like sacrifice than softness, more like responsibility than affection. And for children, that can feel confusing, because someone can love you and still feel emotionally far away. And maybe this is the strange part to realize. Some people spent their entire lives trying to survive emotionally without ever learning how to feel emotionally safe. In some homes, nobody talked about difficult emotions. Not grief, not fear, not loneliness. Problems were minimized, pain became private, and difficult feelings quietly disappeared into routine. So children growing up in those homes learned something subtle. Keep things to yourself. Don't be too emotional. Don't make life harder for other people. Don't fall apart. And eventually, silence stops feeling uncomfortable. It starts feeling familiar, even normal. Until one day, you realize emotional closeness feels harder than it should. Not because something is wrong with you, but because distance became something you learned early. This is why some people struggle to open up, ask for help, trust emotional closeness, or even understand what they feel. Because emotional habits don't only come from personality. Sometimes they come from generations of emotional survival. A father who never learned vulnerability raises a son who feels guilty expressing emotion. A mother who hid every struggle raises a daughter who learns emotional needs feel too much. And without anyone fully noticing, the pattern quietly continues, not through words, but through behavior. Maybe you've seen this before. An older man who worked hard his entire life, provided for everyone, never avoided responsibility, always showed up, but somehow could barely talk about what he felt. Not because he didn't care, but because somewhere deep down, he learned emotions were things you carried alone. Or maybe you grew up in a house where silence filled the room more than conversation did, where nobody yelled, nobody openly fought, but emotional closeness still felt strangely absent. And as a child, you quietly adapted to that too. You stopped asking for too much, stopped sharing difficult feelings, started learning how to handle things on your own, without realizing where you learned it. Pause for a second. How many emotional habits do we call personality when they were actually survival patterns? How many parts of ourselves feel normal simply because we grew up surrounded by silence? At first, emotional suppression can look like strength. You stay composed, you keep functioning, you don't burden anyone. But over time, something starts disappearing. Connection feels harder. Vulnerability feels uncomfortable. Even love can feel difficult to express naturally. And eventually, people stop asking, "What do I feel?" Because they've spent years learning not to look there at all. Sometimes, the hardest emotions to understand are the ones we were never taught to name. The hardest part is this: many older generations never had the chance to emotionally rest. They carried pressure quietly, pain quietly, fear quietly, and because survival worked for them, they often believed the next generation should learn to survive the same way too. Not out of cruelty, not because they wanted distance, but because endurance was the only emotional language they were given. And sometimes, people can only pass down what they were taught, even when love is there. Maybe love felt distant growing up, not because nobody cared, but because the people raising you were carrying emotional habits they never learned how to question. Some generations weren't taught how to express emotions. They were taught how to endure them. And sometimes, the emotional distance we feel today didn't begin with us at all. It began long before we were born, passed quietly through homes that looked functional on the outside, while teaching people to hide everything inside. And maybe understanding that is the first step to finally breaking the pattern. If this felt real, you're not alone. Here we explore growth, success, and the human mind without noise. Just honesty. I'll see you in the next one.